He wasn't supposed to be a monster. He was supposed to be the nice guy next door, the man who threw block parties, dressed as a clown to make children laugh, and volunteered at the local Democratic headquarters in his Chicago suburb. But under that bright red smile of Pogo the Clown lived one of America's darkest predators, John Wayne Gacy. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy's childhood was defined by contradictions, kindness from his mother and cruelty from his father. His father, a hard-drinking World War II veteran, would often call him Sissy, Mama's boy, and beat him for the smallest mistake. At the same time, his mother, Marion, tried to shield him, creating an emotional tug-of-war that twisted Gacy's sense of identity early on. As a boy, Gacy was sickly. He suffered blackouts and was hospitalized frequently, which left him feeling weak, ashamed, and desperate to prove himself. That desperation, the need to appear normal, successful, and loved, would become a dangerous obsession. By his teens, Gacy began realizing something he couldn't tell anyone. He was attracted to other men. In the 1950s Midwest, that kind of truth could destroy a life. So Gacy did what many predators learn early. He hid behind a mask. A mask of smiles, charm, and politeness. A mask that fooled everyone. He married young, to a woman named Marlon Myers, and moved to Waterloo, Iowa, to manage his father-in-law's KFC restaurants. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman, the guy who threw dinner parties and told jokes. But beneath that cheerful exterior, his double life was already beginning. He started luring teenage boys, mostly employees, into his basement, offering alcohol and showing adult films. When one of them reported Gacy for sexual assault in 1968, his carefully built image collapsed overnight. He was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His wife divorced him, took the kids, and moved away. Most people assumed that was the end of John Wayne Gacy's story. But prison didn't reform him, it refined him. Inside, he became a model inmate, organizing events, cooking for others, and gaining the trust of guards. He was released early, after only 18 months, for good behavior. The world had just let a monster out. When Gacy returned to Chicago in 1970, he decided to reinvent himself again, a businessman, a clown, a community man. He started a construction company, PDM Contractors, and began working with young men, often those desperate for work. At the same time, he joined local organizations, hosted neighborhood gatherings, and even entertained kids at hospitals dressed as his clown persona, Pogo. The duality was complete. By day, Gacy was the friendly contractor and clown. By night, he was hunting. He learned from his past mistakes. He no longer targeted people close to him. He picked victims society wouldn't notice: runaways, young hitchhikers, or kids from troubled homes. He'd lure them in with promises of work, money, or simply a place to stay. Once they were inside his modest house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, they rarely left. Neighbors heard laughter, parties, power tools late at night, but never suspected a thing. One of them would later recall, "He was always so friendly, you'd never think he could hurt anyone." Over the next 6 years, John Wayne Gacy would live a life of twisted normalcy, shaking hands with politicians, taking photos with children, and at the same time, committing some of the most gruesome murders in American history. Behind the clown makeup, behind the community charm, behind that painted red smile, was a killer meticulously constructing his own hell, right beneath his house. By the mid-1970s, life at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue looked picture-perfect, at least from the outside. John Wayne Gacy was now a respected local businessman, running his construction company, PDM Contractors, and staying deeply involved in the community. He was known for his loud laugh, big parties, and constant willingness to help anyone in need. He even had photos with politicians, including the First Lady at the time, Rosalind Carter. In one of those photos, you can see Gacy proudly wearing his Secret Service pin. What nobody knew was that he was already hiding multiple bodies beneath his home. The first known murder occurred in January 1972, just 2 years after his early release from prison. A teenage boy he'd lured home, someone nobody would miss right away. It was impulsive, messy, and shocking even to Gacy himself. But once he realized he could get away with it, it became a pattern. Soon 1 became 2, 2 became 10. And the crawl space under his house slowly began to fill. Neighbors sometimes complained about a foul smell, a thick, rotting odor that seemed to rise from Gacy's backyard and into their homes on hot summer nights. Gacy always had an excuse ready. He'd laugh it off, saying, "It's just the sewer line, gotta get it fixed someday." He even brought in workers to pour lime in the crawl space to cover up the smell. Nobody suspected what was truly decomposing beneath their feet. At the same time, Gacy's business was thriving. He hired dozens of young men, mostly teens and runaways, paying them in cash for construction work. Some of them were never seen again. He'd tell coworkers that those boys had run off to California or quit suddenly. No one thought much of it. It was the 1970s, people disappeared all the time. But inside that house, Gacy's darkness was growing bolder. He developed a ritual. He'd offer his victims a drink or drugs, or sometimes show them a magic trick, the handcuff trick. He'd put the cuffs on himself, pretending to show how to escape. Then he'd convince his victim to try it. Once the cuffs clicked shut, he'd smile and say quietly, "The trick is, you can't get out." Then the torture would begin. And by the time it ended, another body would be dragged into the crawl space. Over time, even Gacy began to run out of room. He hired one of his workers, David Cram, to spread lime and dig trenches under the house, telling him it was for plumbing. Cram didn't think twice. He didn't know he was digging graves. Despite the growing smell and the strange late-night noises, Gacy's neighbors never connected the dots. He was, after all, John, the nice guy, the clown, the community man. He'd dress up as Pogo the Clown for parades and children's hospitals, wearing a red nose, white makeup, and a wide painted grin. It became his disguise, his armor, the smiling mask that let him blend in while hiding unimaginable cruelty. By 1977, the disappearances were adding up. Police reports from across Chicago listed teenage boys who'd vanished without a trace. Many were last seen near gas stations or bus stops. But there was no clear link, no pattern investigators could see yet. Until December 1978. On a cold winter night, December 11, a 15-year-old named Robert Peast was working his shift at a local pharmacy. Gacy had stopped by that evening to discuss a potential remodeling job with the store owner. He struck up a conversation with Robert, mentioning that his construction company paid good money to young men who worked for him. Robert told his mother he'd be right back. He was just going to talk to that contractor about a job. He never returned. When Robert didn't come home, his mother immediately knew something was wrong. He wasn't the kind of kid to just disappear. She called the police that night, and they began asking questions. Witnesses remembered Robert mentioning Gacy's name before leaving. It was the first time Gacy's double life began to crack in public view. When detectives knocked on his door, Gacy was calm, even polite. He laughed, made jokes, and claimed he'd never met the boy. His confidence was unnerving, almost rehearsed. He was so used to controlling people, he thought he could charm his way through this too. But this time, he couldn't talk his way out. Investigators decided to look closer. They began surveillance, watched his movements, and slowly built a case. As days passed and Gacy realized the police were tailing him, his composure started to crumble. He was drinking more, sleeping less, making strange calls, and acting erratically. His world, the world he'd hidden behind laughter, parties, and makeup, was finally closing in. The stench in the house of 8213 West Somerdale was no longer just rot. It was fear. And soon, the police would discover exactly what lay beneath. By December 1978, Chicago's winter had turned bitterly cold, the kind of cold that cuts through coats and clings to your bones. Detectives at the Des Plaines Police Department were running out of leads in the case of 15-year-old Robert Peast, the boy who had vanished after talking to John Wayne Gacy. But something about Gacy didn't sit right. He was too calm, too confident, and every time they spoke to him, his story seemed to change just slightly. Detective Lt. Joseph Kozingczak, a seasoned investigator, decided to dig deeper. When he ran a background check on Gacy, what he found made his blood run cold: a previous conviction for sexual assault of a teenage boy in Iowa. That alone was enough to treat him as a serious suspect. Police brought Gacy in for questioning again. This time, his tone was more defensive. He claimed Robert Peast had never been in his car, that he'd left the pharmacy long before the boy disappeared. But investigators had a witness who contradicted that, a store employee who had seen Gacy and Robert talking that night. The next step was a search warrant. On December 13, 1978, police entered Gacy's house for the first time. What they found didn't immediately prove murder, but it painted a deeply unsettling picture. Inside the home, detectives found several items that didn't belong to a man like Gacy. Teenage boy's clothing that didn't fit him. A high school class ring with the initials JAS. Handcuffs. A contractor's book listing names of young employees, several of whom were missing. And most disturbing, a foul, thick odor rising from the floor vents. When one officer asked about the smell, Gacy smirked and said, "Oh, that's just a clogged drain." The team left uneasy, with a feeling that something terrible was hiding just out of sight. Over the next few days, detectives kept Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. They followed him everywhere, to restaurants, construction sites, even bars. What they didn't expect was how brazen he'd be about it. Gacy began taunting them, buying them coffee, laughing, even inviting them into diners. He acted like a man untouchable, a man who believed the mask he'd built would never break. But beneath that calm surface, Gacy was unraveling. He wasn't sleeping. He was drinking constantly. He'd drive for hours aimlessly around the city, muttering to himself. Detectives later described him as a man haunted by the ghosts of his own basement. Meanwhile, police were piecing together the names of missing young men who had worked for Gacy's company. One name stood out: John Scheich, the same initials found on the class ring in Gacy's home. That ring was now undeniable evidence that something was very, very wrong. With mounting suspicion, investigators secured a second search warrant, this time to dig deeper. On December 21, 1978, a forensics team re-entered Gacy's home. They focused on the crawl space, where the smell was strongest. As they removed floorboards and began digging into the damp soil, an officer's shovel struck something soft. It wasn't dirt. It was flesh. At that moment, everything stopped. The team stared at each other in silence as the realization hit: they had just uncovered human remains. The clogged drain excuse was over. Detectives confronted Gacy at a nearby gas station, where he'd stopped for a drink. He was pale, shaking, and muttering that his life was over. When they took him into custody, he confessed almost immediately, not with tears or remorse but with cold detachment. He calmly told police there were a lot of bodies in his house. He didn't even know how many. When asked why, he said simply, "I enjoyed the power of taking life." The words chilled every man in that interrogation room. As teams worked overnight, the house on 8213 West Somerdale Avenue transformed into a crime scene from a nightmare. Officers dug through mud, debris, and decay, uncovering one body after another. Each wrapped, each hidden carefully, as if the crawl space had become a cemetery built by one man's madness. By morning, the count had already reached 8 bodies, and the digging had barely begun. Gacy sat in custody smoking, talking casually as if recounting a routine day. He told them he'd buried 26 victims under his house and dumped others in the nearby Des Plaines River. For years, this man had lived among them, shaking hands with neighbors, joking with police, dressing as a clown for charity, while using his home as a tomb. As daylight hit the quiet suburban street, reporters, police, and horrified onlookers gathered outside the small white house. The stench of death finally had a face. The man everyone thought they knew, the clown, the contractor, the neighbor, was now revealed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. December 22, 1978. The freezing wind swept across 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, carrying with it the smell of earth, gasoline, and decay. Floodlights turned night into day as police, forensic teams, and journalists gathered outside the small, unassuming house, the home of a man who had once been a local hero. Beneath that house was hell. Detective Kozenzak stood near the entrance, his face pale as officers went in and out, carrying shovels and body bags. The crawl space was small, less than 3 feet high, a dark maze of dirt and rotting timbers. To reach it, investigators had to crawl on their stomachs, using only flashlights and the reek of death to guide them. The first body they uncovered the night before had been that of a young man, bones still intact, rope still tied around his wrists. But now, as they dug further, they realized there were more bodies buried in layers, stacked one on top of another. Each victim had been carefully positioned, covered with lime and plastic sheets to mask the smell. It was methodical, organized, almost ritualistic. The officers worked in silence. No one spoke, no one joked. All you could hear were the scraping of shovels and the muffled sound of breathing masks. When the second skull appeared through the dirt, one detective whispered, "There's another one." By the end of that day, they had found 3 more victims. And this was only the beginning. Back at the station, Gacy was surprisingly calm. He spoke to detectives like a man recounting a hobby. "I'm not a bad person," he said, lighting a cigarette. "I gave most of them jobs, food, a place to stay, but some of them they didn't want to leave, so I made sure they couldn't." That statement alone chilled the room. It wasn't rage or passion, it was control. As Gacy continued talking, his confessions painted a timeline of horror spanning nearly 6 years. He admitted to luring teenage boys and young men, most of them drifters, hitchhikers, or runaways, to his house with promises of work at his contracting company, PDM Contractors. Once inside, he'd offer them drinks, show them his handcuff trick, and within minutes the laughter would turn to screams. His victims were bound, tortured, and murdered, usually strangled with a rope tightened by a stick, something he chillingly called his rope trick. When detectives asked how he could live above all that, he smirked and said, "It's my house, I had to live somewhere." The digging continued for days. By Christmas Eve, the count had reached 11 bodies, then 15, then 21. Neighbors watched in disbelief as trucks hauled away dirt and debris. The once friendly man who hosted barbecues and wore a clown suit for children's parties was now the center of one of America's darkest crime scenes. Media swarmed the area. Headlines screamed, "Killer Clown House yields 27 bodies." Bodies found under contractor's home. The nickname Killer Clown spread like wildfire, haunting every news broadcast. Among the victims identified were boys as young as 14 years old. Most had vanished from nearby towns or had been reported missing by families who thought they'd simply run away. Police discovered that Gacy had buried 26 victims under his house and dumped at least 3 more into the Des Plaines River when he ran out of room in the crawl space. Forensic experts faced a nightmare task. Many bodies were decomposed beyond recognition. Bones tangled together, faces unrecognizable. It would take months, even years, to identify them using dental records, fingerprints, and later DNA. But each body told its own silent story. Signs of restraint, of suffering, of hopeless attempts to escape. And yet through all of it, Gacy seemed almost detached, even cheerful at times. He joked with guards, ate his meals, read the newspaper. When asked if he ever felt guilty, he replied, "Guilt, I sleep fine. I've done a lot for this community." To the public, he was no longer human. He was a monster in a man's body. On January 9, 1979, after weeks of excavation, investigators completed their search of the crawl space. A total of 29 bodies were found linked directly to John Wayne Gacy. 26 under his house, 3 in the river. It became one of the largest and most gruesome crime discoveries in U.S. history. When prosecutors prepared charges, Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder, the final confirmed number after linking additional disappearances to him through confessions and evidence. Each victim represented a stolen life, a dream cut short, a family left to search for answers for years. And yet, even in the face of this mountain of evidence, Gacy pleaded not guilty. His defense: that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, claiming that Jack, an evil alter ego, committed the murders while Gacy himself had no memory of it. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. The organization of his crimes, the cleaning, the burial patterns, the careful deception, pointed to a calculating predator, not a man lost in madness. By the time the trial began in February 1980, the world knew the name John Wayne Gacy, not as a clown or a contractor, but as a symbol of evil hiding behind a smile. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding justice. Inside, families sat silently, clutching photos of sons who never came home. As prosecutors laid out the details, the handcuffs, the rope, the crawl space, the courtroom fell into horrified silence. One juror later said, "You could smell the evil in that room." And as for Gacy, he sat back, arms folded, occasionally smiling as if watching a show about someone else. February 6, 1980. The doors of the Cook County Courthouse opened to a sea of cameras, reporters, and protesters. John Wayne Gacy, once a beloved contractor, party clown, and community volunteer, now entered as the most hated man in America. For the first time, the world would hear the full scope of his crimes, not rumors, not speculation, but evidence. And when the truth was read aloud in that courtroom, it silenced even the most hardened reporters. Gacy arrived wearing a suit, smiling at the cameras, as if still trying to charm his audience. Reporters shouted questions. "John, how many did you kill? Do you feel any remorse?" Gacy just grinned. "I'll let the trial speak for itself," he said. Inside, prosecutors laid out a timeline so horrifying it barely seemed real. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy had murdered 33 young men and boys, most of them lured with the promise of construction jobs or a place to stay. He buried 26 under his house, 3 near the river, and 4 others in shallow graves around his property. Each crime followed the same ritual: the handcuff trick, the rope, the burial, and then the next victim. Prosecutor Robert Egan said it best: "This man spent years building a graveyard beneath his own home, while entertaining children as a clown above it." That line stayed with everyone. Gacy's lawyers argued that he was legally insane, that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, and that a dark alter ego, Jack Hanley, had committed the murders. Psychiatrists took the stand to describe the two sides of Gacy: the charming businessman and the violent predator. But the prosecution fought back hard. They showed photos, maps, and testimony that proved calculated, organized behavior. He had poured lime over the bodies to mask the smell. He had planned disposal methods. He had continued his clown appearances while bodies lay beneath his feet. That wasn't madness. That was control. Cold, methodical, unfeeling control. One witness, a survivor, told the jury about Gacy's handcuff trick. He demonstrated how Gacy would cuff the victim's hands behind their back, laughing as he said, "You know the trick. You can't get out unless I show you." And then he'd whisper, "The trick is you don't." The courtroom went silent. After 5 weeks of testimony, over 100 witnesses, and a mountain of evidence, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than 2 hours. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection. When the judge read the sentence, Gacy simply nodded and smiled. His final words that day: "Kiss my ass." He was transferred to Murd Correctional Center, where he spent 14 years on death row. Behind bars, Gacy remained as manipulative as ever. He painted clowns, celebrities, and skulls, over 2,000 paintings that he sold for thousands of dollars. He gave interviews, taunting reporters with contradictions and sarcasm. He claimed he was framed. He claimed some of the bodies were placed by others. And then in other interviews, he laughed about the details of his killings, almost proud of the chaos he caused. When asked once if he considered himself evil, he said, "Evil, no, I'm just misunderstood." But his actions spoke louder than words. Even from prison, he thrived on control, on attention, on being the center of fear. Families of the victims never stopped visiting the site of his home, which was eventually demolished. In its place now stands a new house, but the ground beneath it still carries the memory of what was once there. On May 10, 1994, after more than a decade of appeals, Gacy's final day arrived. He ordered a last meal of fried chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. He joked with guards, laughed as if none of it were real. At 12:58 a.m., Gacy was strapped to the gurney inside the Stateville Correctional Center. Witnesses filled the small observation room, separated by glass. When asked for his last words, he said, "Kiss my ass." At 1:00 a.m., the lethal injection began. 8 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. The man who hid behind a painted smile had finally fallen silent. When news of his execution spread, crowds gathered outside the prison, cheering and setting off fireworks. For many, it was closure. For others, it was a grim reminder that monsters can live among us, and sometimes they wear smiles. Over the following years, investigators used advances in DNA technology to identify several of Gacy's unknown victims, some as recently as the 2010s. Even decades later, 5 victims remain unidentified. Their graves, marked only by numbers, are the last mysteries of Gacy's darkness. But what made John Wayne Gacy truly terrifying wasn't just the number of his victims. It was the illusion of normalcy. He fooled neighbors, friends, and even police for years. He was the friendly clown, the community helper, the smiling face at your doorstep. And behind that smile was a graveyard. Epilogue: the face behind the mask. In the end, John Wayne Gacy became a symbol, not just of evil, but of deception. He showed the world that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they shake your hand. Sometimes they entertain your children. And sometimes they wear a clown's face. Subscribe for more daily true crime stories.